I think if we focus only on the persecution story, which is a real story, it's not that I or ChinaSource is saying, oh, that's not, it's not, oh, persecution is not a problem. It's a huge problem. The Chinese church is a persecuted church, but that's not its only identity. And I think that if we focus exclusively on that identity or on that narrative, we will only be able to see our Christian brothers and sisters as victims.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Living Enviado podcast. My name is Steve Shermer and I am your host. And today we're going to be talking about something that is getting a lot of, news, at least the subject matter is, which is China. And the reason I want to talk about it is I keep seeing a lot of things online. I keep seeing a lot of content creators who I would argue have less experience than a fry cook trying to talk like experts about China. Now, I've lived in China. I know quite a bit, I would say, relatively speaking, compared to most people in the United States, but I wanted someone who has even far more experience than I do and someone that's got a level head. So I didn't want someone who's a sensationalist to come on and talk about what's going on in China with the church. And so I invited my friend Joann Pittman. So Joann, thank you for joining me. We have never met in person, but we have met several times online. And I just thank you for giving me another chance to talk to you.
Thank you for having me.
So why don't we start and just give kind of a 36,000 foot view of just who you are, what you do. I know you don't like to brag on yourself, but if you could just brag on yourself a little bit to give yourself some kind of a background of why I invited you in the first place.
Give some street cred.
Sure.
Yeah, sure. I first went to China. Well, the first time I went to China was 1979 when I was in college. I was doing an internship in Hong Kong, and I had the chance to go in and look around. And in one city, it was like, oh, that's interesting. And then in 1984, I joined an organization that was sending Christian English teachers to China. So in 1984, I went to China for what I thought was going to be 1 year of English teaching. And I ended up staying and living and working in China until 2012. So as I say, it was a really, really long year. And I worked in 3 different cities in China, one in the central part of the country, in the Northeast, and then 15 years in Beijing. Back in the States in 2012, and have been serving since then with an organization called ChinaSource, as the vice president for partnerships in China engagement. So even though I live in the States now, China is still my life and work.
And I'm glad you brought up ChinaSource. So we're going to put the link to ChinaSource in the description.
Right.
I like ChinaSource a lot because the stuff you guys put out are very, in my opinion, very balanced. And really I know you guys work hard trying to give an accurate picture of what's happened, which actually is why I brought you on here, because you wrote an article that was it published with ChinaSource? I know it was published with Desiring God, the John Piper Ministry.
It was just published on Desiring God. They asked me to write it.
Okay. And we'll put that article as well so people can get to it and read it. It's not very long, but I think it's an accurate picture, kind of like a 36,000 foot view of China and its relationship with the church. And you go into a few things. Of course, you're hitting kind of hot topics really quickly. You're not going in depth, but I think it's worth a read. And it's called The Church in China Learning to Fly in a Bird Cage. So let's start with why did you use the word birdcage?
I use the word birdcage for a couple of reasons. First of all, I've heard Chinese Christian friends refer to life in China as life in a birdcage, particularly for them now. And one Chinese friend had mentioned to me back in the spring that she felt like the birdcage was getting smaller. And so when I was asked to write the article about, kind of the current situation, I had that in my mind. And then so I did a little bit of research and realized that the metaphor of China as a birdcage has actually been around for a while. It was used by a party leader, Chinese Communist Party leader in 1980, when Deng Xiaoping was trying to open up the economy and allow free market enterprise, capitalism, if you will, in. And this party leader was a little bit, I think, skeptical and wanted to make sure that it would not weaken the party's power over the country. And so he said the Chinese economy was like a bird cage. And he said the bird, or the free market, could only be allowed to fly within confines of a state planned economy, or in other words, the bird cage. So Chinese, and what he was saying is Chinese capitalism must be controlled by the Communist Party. And I think that metaphor really applies to all of Chinese life today, not just Christians. It is a birdcage. Within the birdcage, there's things people can do. During the time that you and I were working in China, the birdcage was pretty big, but it's gotten smaller. But it's all within the confines of what the state says. And in other words, I've often said about the church in China that the government says you can do this, you can believe what you want, but we set the boundaries. And I think so. The birdcage metaphor is just a way to say whatever happens in China, it's the state, the party state, that's setting the boundaries.
So I know in China we've got two primary type of churches. We have the Three Self-Patriotic Movement Church, which is also known as the official church or registered church or government church, whatever phrase you want to use. And you have the underground church or house church movement, as many people refer to it as. So I'm curious, between the two groups, are Christians actually flying within the birdcage? Or they, you described what that is, and I know what you're talking about, because there's always a lot of control taking place. But are Christians actually living within that birdcage, or are they kind of spreading their wings and trying to fly kind of on the peripheral or outside of it?
Well, I think the answer to your question is yes. Um, that they are in the birdcage because everybody inside China is in the birdcage, and everybody in China since Xi Jinping came to power is living with and adapting to more and more state control. The party has really reasserted its control over society. And so the question is, how do you adapt, and how do you manage the smaller space for doing whatever it is you're doing, whether you're a lawyer or a teacher or a Christian. And so yeah, they are doing things. The restrictions and the pressure between on the house churches and the registered churches are a little bit different. For the registered churches, they've got the sinicization campaign, so the pressure to be political is much stronger than it was, say, 10 or 15 years ago. But again, what we hear about are even among registered churches, trying to be creative and do things a different way. So for registered churches, the government is right now very strictly enforcing the ban on teaching religion to children. So churches are not allowed to have children come. And when we were there, Steve, registered churches, a lot of them had Sunday schools. And so what we see are some churches, how do they respond to that? Well, they respond, which is to be creative, to be innovative. And okay, well, we'll go rent an apartment 2 blocks away from the church, and the parents will drop the kids off on the way to church, and we'll give them snacks and read stories to them. So they're still doing things, but everything is harder now. And for unregistered churches, it is definitely much more difficult. Whereas in the past, unregistered churches, particularly in the urban areas, they could have several hundred people and rent an office building. That kind of thing really has gone away, and the government doesn't want them meeting in large groups. And so what you've seen is the kind of a reversion to the old house church model of small group fellowships, actually in the churches. And the amount of pressure depends on local officials. But what are they doing? They're saying, okay, well, maybe the we were trying to follow the Western model of developing and growing large churches. Maybe that doesn't work here. So maybe we need to, as house churches, focus on our communities and meeting in smaller groups and doing evangelism in my apartment building or in my xiaoqiu in my residential neighborhood. So they're still involved in doing things. It's just that they're learning how to do things differently. And Chinese are really good at it. The Chinese have a saying called "Shangyou Zhengsi, Xiaoyu Duizi," which means the leaders make the rules and the people find a way around them. And that's just life in China.
There's always a loophole everywhere in
Oh
China.
yeah,
There's
oh yeah.
always a loophole. This
There's always a way.
there is. That's one of the things about the Chinese church when I talk to people about them. No matter, I talk to people in areas where there's a lot of persecution in other countries, and then they'll say, we can't do this, we can't do this. And I'll say, well, you should go talk to the Chinese, because one thing they have learned to do is be creative, as you're talking about, and find
Right.
the loopholes and,
Yeah,
figure out how to operate, as you described, within the birdcage, within the limitations.
yeah.
Uh,
And can I just make one more comment too?
yeah, go
I
ahead.
think I think we see this in technology as well. During COVID, when everything went online in China, churches went online as well, and they had to learn how to do church online, and the government, of course, didn't like that. So a Christian website pops up or a church website pops up, it gets shut down, but it usually takes them like a couple of days to get going. And so I had a Chinese pastor friend of mine say to me, he said, "Yeah, Chinese Christians are the most technologically savvy people in the world." Because
I,
they spend a good part of their time trying to get around whatever block is coming at them.
I would agree with that. And as you were talking about the birdcage, I wrote down a statement that you wrote in your article, and it says, while we tend to focus on the size of the birdcage, Chinese Christians focus on adapting and being faithful within it. Now, when you're saying while we tend to focus on the size of the birdcage, like, who are you referring to?
I'm referring to Western Christianity, and I'll speak mostly, about Americans because I'm an American, and that's my frame of reference. And the media that I read is American, and so. But I also think it's not just Westerners in general, but it's the Western Church, and I think human beings, we like the sensational. If it bleeds, it leads, is a truism. And so most of the stories that make it into both the secular and Christian media in the US tends to be the persecution stories, which are not unreal. I mean, they're true, but they don't tell the whole story. And I think it's easy for Americans to think, well, if the Communist Party weren't around, then everything would be fine. But a look at Chinese history, there's never been religious freedom as we understand it, and so
Hmm.
the party is the party. It's just another long line of Chinese, governance. And so, on the outside, there's a lot of sort of, oh, we have to advocate, we have to work. That's the main story, is what is the size of the birdcage. And I think what I'm saying here and what we try to do at ChinaSource is, but okay, the birdcage is getting smaller, but what are Chinese Christians doing inside the birdcage? And what we find is that they're thinking about theology, they're thinking about ecclesiology, and how do we do church in this new era? They're trying to raise their children as Christians. They face a lot of the same struggles that every other Chinese person faces, and they're adapting. So persecution is not the only story, and the size of the birdcage isn't the biggest story, in my opinion.
Yeah, when you were talking about that, I was thinking, I think sometimes we in the US, we focus so much on the size of the bird cage that we actually become inactive or ineffective in our Christian witness
Mhm,
because we're
mhm,
just too focused on preserving that size,
mhm,
preserving the movement without actually moving. And yet,
mhm,
the Chinese church is, as you said, they're dealing with their ecclesiology, they're dealing with their theology, they're dealing with how you raise a family within, where they're at. They're
mhm.
dealing with serving. And I think you wrote in the article, you were talking about how, within the persecution, they'll go after churches, as we know, with, Pastor Wong, who's, I think you wrote, about to come out of prison. And then we know
I think
Pastor
next
G
year.
next year, and then there's Pastor Gene or Ezra, as Americans know him, who was just released and came to the
Yeah.
U.S., who was in custody since last October, and so you have all these sometimes big churches because you talked about renting big halls and things like that. And I remember in 2012 or 2013, I was sitting down with a pastor friend of mine, and he was talking. He was like, "Oh, we're going to do this," and he was renting this big hall, and he was talking about the carpet and the curtains and all this thing. And I looked at him and I said, "You do realize that around the corner, that's probably not going to work." I just had this sense that around the corner something was coming.
Mhm.
Took a few years, but it started coming. And yet, so a lot of them lost what they had, which isn't inherently wrong to have it. It just in their environment they lost it. And you talked about it's scattered, like it didn't end who they are. Like I guess some people think, well, they cracked down on a church. They cracked down on Pastor Ezra's church, Zion Church in Beijing. Oh, it's over now. But is that reality?
No, no, that's not really it. No, that's the funny thing. And as I often say about China, everything is complicated and nothing makes sense. And I think this is one of those instances. A church can get cracked down on, but in most cases, they don't simply cease to exist. Zion Church experienced their first harsh crackdown, I think, in 2018, and they had to close their physical space in Beijing. So they began moving towards an online model where they would, broadcast the pastors, preaching and things like that, and meeting in small, not doing online to individuals, but smaller groups meeting, and so that's what happens. The government might come, the local officials might come and say to a church, maybe they have 100 people, maybe they have 500 people, you can't meet, and so the church goes, okay, well, what's your, you know, how many people are you going to tolerate? And a lot of places are like, yeah, 20, 25, 30s. Okay, then we'll just break into groups of 25 people. So so the net result is, of course, that you're multiplying churches. And so I've used the term sometimes Communist Party led church multiplication. It's like so they don't just say if you gather we're gonna, but they just meet in smaller groups and are learning how to do church again. And I think for many, particularly young urban Christians who only knew the more open era of the 2000s, the first decade of this century, um, they're they're kind of learning that, oh yeah, things are hard and this is how we do it. The older people are like, yeah, Back to the Future. And so they're kind of learning that maybe those big models aren't really relevant for China. And so Zion Church, it just kept going, smaller groups, and then they went online, and so there's Zion fellowship groups that are meeting all over the country. So the church still is functioning. It just looks very, very different.
So, with all the headlines that are going in Christian media and content creators focusing, as you said, on the persecution as the big story, as you said, if it bleeds, it leads. But is this reality across all of China? Like, are churches in, let's say, Xi'an or Guangzhou or places like that? Are they experiencing the same things as Zion Church or Early Rain Church?
Um, the pressure, the persecution and pressure does vary from place to place. There are parts of China that are more open. I think Shanghai would be a place that's much more open. And the birdcage in Shanghai, we could say, is bigger than the birdcage in Xi'an, or if you go further west, the birdcage barely exists. So it's really hard to say, one one thing about all of China, other than that it's complicated. Um, so Shanghai, I think maybe Guangzhou would be probably more open, and Xiamen and some of the, Wenzhou, some of the coastal cities, things would be more open. It doesn't mean that churches in those places don't cross some red line that the local officials are not going to tolerate. And then they'll come down on them. But I would say then the further west you go, the more difficult it gets, particularly once you hit Xi'an, which is kind of that marks sort of the boundary between Han China and then China of the minorities. And of course, the minority situation is all wrapped up with China's desire and goals of ethnic unity. And so moving further west, the birdcage gets much smaller, and you are much more likely to find harsher crackdowns or Christians gathering in smaller groups than you would see, say, in Shanghai.
When we lived in China and we went to visit. Now we lived in Xi'an, and it's still my favorite city in the whole country.
It's a great one.
And so we took my family. We went on vacation to Shanghai one summer. I can't remember which summer, but anyways, we get there and we're going around for several days. We're there for a week, and about 2 or 3 days into it, my daughter, who was probably 5 at the time, 4 or 5, asked us when we were returning back to China. I mean,
You probably still would have that response. I was in Shanghai earlier in the year, and I did not feel like I was in China.
well, I know this is off topic, but I was at a church there and I met this guy. He's in business and he had been there for 15 years. And he started talking about how long he'd been in China. And I just rattled off. I said, dude, you actually don't live in China. You live in Shanghai. That's different.
Yeah.
If you want to talk about living in China, you need to leave and go somewhere else.
Yeah,
But
and so it is very different. So I think that's an important point, is that we hear stories or people visit places, and what we might see or hear from one place is the reality of that place, but it doesn't necessarily translate to the whole. I have heard recently that things are actually quite tight in Beijing for Christians. Whereas when I lived there, Beijing was sort of the Wild West. You could kind of do anything, but Beijing is much more restrictive now than it used to be.
yeah, there's a lot of nuance around the country. I mean, as you've already indicated, what happens in Beijing doesn't happen necessarily in Xi'an, and it doesn't necessarily happen in Guangzhou or Urumqi. It's just one of those things. You've really got to break it down to each province, and then from the province to each city, because each city within a province can be different.
And
And
then within the city, you've got to break it down to districts, because I mean, I know of situations where church was meeting, or maybe there was a underground school, Christian school that existed there, and the local officials, are like, you can't do this, and so the response of the church or the school or whatever is to move to another district. And the officials who come to them, they're like, they're not like they're trying to stop them. They're just like, we don't want to deal with you. And if the solution is you leave my district, that's great. Then I don't have to deal with it. And they go to a district maybe that the local, it's more rural, or the local officials are more, are friendlier to this kind of thing. So a lot of times it's just based on who the local officials are and what their level of tolerance is.
So, in keeping with the birdcage theme, another sensationalized headline that, for whatever reason, in the past 6 months seems to have gotten another bit of, I guess, someone breathed life into it or something again, even though it seems like an old story. But the story of Bibles. Headlines talking about China is rewriting the Bible. So since it's gotten some traction in the last 6 months, again, maybe not a whole lot, maybe it's more than I think, but what's the reality of China rewriting the Bible?
Well, I think the first thing is nobody knows, because what happened was, I think it was 7 or 8 years ago now, when the sinicization project was just getting going. And the sinicization project is the government saying, all sectors of society, including religion, have to, conform to Chinese socialist principles, which just means just obey the party. And so there was all this pressure to do things, some local churches said, oh, okay, I'll put up a flag, I'll put up a picture of Xi Jinping, whatever, and I'll call it, say I've been sinicized. But the registered church, the China Christian Council, Three Self, kind of, they have to write a 5-year plan. And in the 5-year plan, they have to say what they're going to do to promote and get on board with the sinicization campaign. They said, oh, we're going to produce a new translation of the Bible that is going to, be in line with this. And so that hit the West, and everybody, kind of lost their heads, running around screaming, Communist Party is rewriting the Bible. And then, so that was a 5-year plan 8 years ago. I believe that since then, they haven't said anything about it. In their 5 years later, in their next, in their work report, they didn't really say anything like, oh, here's progress we're making. Nor did they say, oh, we're continuing the project. It's just kind of, in China, it's gone silent. And people aren't talking about it. I think what happened was they felt like they had to write it in their 5-year report, and maybe they've got it. Maybe they've got a couple of people working, somewhere, but most scholars outside of China who know Chinese church stuff really doubt that it will happen, because the registered church in China doesn't really have the level of expertise to do translation work from the Hebrew and the Greek. So most people think, like scholars I'm talking about in the West, think that there might be a group somewhere kind of slowly working on it, but it's, they're not on the verge of releasing a new Bible. And the other thing too is that even if they do come out, maybe maybe in the next 2 or 3 years, they say, oh, we've got this new translation done by the CCC, and, here it is. And, there may be some little changes from the China Union version, which many scholars also say needs some changing. But the reality in China is that the China Union version, which is the translation that's pretty much used, it's been in use for 100 years, is so deeply ingrained in the hearts of Chinese Christians that even if another translation were to show up, I can't imagine Chinese Christians accepting it or looking at it. There are modern translations of the Bible in Chinese now that have been done outside of mainland China that I have heard are quite good, but they get zero traction within China because the Bible is the Union version. So I think the weeping and gnashing of teeth that happens out in the West is overblown, because there's just no evidence right now that they're actually working on it. And even if they get it done and, have a ceremony, Chinese Christians are not going to use it. So it's just one of those, I don't know. You're right. It's a story that cycles around.
I like the weeping and gnashing of teeth
Yeah.
metaphor that you're using. I mean, Chinese have this thing kind of, it's culturally ingrained with them. I mean, they stick with history, whether it's good or bad. I mean, it just
Yep.
sticks with them, even if they weren't alive during that time. So
Yeah.
I've come across Christians. I've asked about other translations, and they, even though they would admit it would probably be easier to read, their churches were not going to accept these modern translations.
No.
It's no different from a fundamentalist independent Baptist church in the U.S. who is a KJV only church. They're
Right.
not going to pick up a ESV,
Right.
an NIV, NASB, or whatever. They're going to stick with the KJV, and that's kind of the mindset.
Mhm.
So, and in
Yeah.
reality, I personally think it's a non-story. I just
Yeah.
know people
I do
like to talk
too.
about it.
Yeah.
So,
It's a
obviously,
birdcage story.
yes. Obviously, there's a lot of, most of what we hear, whether in Christian media or content creation, is relatively negative when it comes to China and its relationship with the church. But there's also another side to the church in China. And there's a side that's actually, you hear some people talk about it, but I don't think it gets very much traction because it's probably not as attractive to some. It's not sensationalized. But what are some of those what's some of the good stuff that's going on with the church in China?
Some of the good things are they are, like I think we talked before, they're being creative, and so they're looking for, what can they do within the space. There are Christian NGOs in China that are looking to um, meet the social needs of society, trafficking, orphans, and things like that. It's very difficult work, and there's a lot of harassment and pressure, but there's a fairly large number of Chinese Christian NGOs in China. There are, and they're working with, elder care and things like that. I think another big story is missions. Is that there are now Chinese missionaries who are leaving China to do cross-cultural missions all over the world, but right now we're seeing it primarily in Southeast Asia and the Middle East are the big areas, places where we're seeing Chinese missionaries go. So, when I went to China, and probably when you went to China as well, Steve, the idea of Chinese missionaries being sent out from the Chinese church would have been just, crazy talk. But that's happening as well. Um, Chinese families and parents are getting very creative in education. So even though homeschooling is officially illegal, there's some really interesting things being done just by Christians, off the grid schooling to provide a Christian education for their children because they don't want their kids in the public schools teach atheism and things like that. So I think it's what I wrote in the article is they're doing personal evangelism, they're doing discipleship, they're doing church, but they're realizing that has to look different. There are seminaries, there are underground seminaries in China that are doing theological training to train pastors, to train lay leaders. Um, and churches are functioning. And in cities like Shanghai, churches maybe can still meet at a hotel or rent a space for 100 people. And in Xi'an, maybe they can do it with 10. But churches are still meeting and they're praying, and there's online There's there's online prayer gatherings that are happening inside China. Maybe the Zoom link changes every week, or maybe where you gather changes every week, but it's still happening. And that's why I think one of the other things I said in the article was that I think if we focus only on the persecution story, which is a real story, it's not that I or ChinaSource is saying, oh, that's not, it's not, oh, persecution is not a problem. It's a huge problem. The Chinese church is a persecuted church, but that's not its only identity. And I think that if we focus exclusively on that identity or on that narrative, as we talk about in ChinaSource, then we will only be able to see our Christian brothers and sisters as victims. And if they're victims, it's going to make us hard to learn from them. So we need to be saying, okay, what are they doing and what can we learn? What lessons do they have for us? And I think there are a lot of them. And so, yes, the persecution narrative is real, but it's not the only narrative. It's not the only story.
Yeah, I think when I think about them, I'm constantly reminded that there's I'm obviously pro religious freedom. I'm pro the freedoms we
Oh, yeah.
enjoy in the United States. I'm pro trying to preserve them. But on the flip side of that, I'm not naive to think that freedom is our Christianity is dependent on freedom. I don't believe
Right.
that our ability to function as believers is dependent on how much freedom we have. And watching the church in China to me just keeps reinforcing that thought.
Right.
As after 1979, when China opened up and there was still a lot of persecution. And yes, it eased off a bit, as you talked about, in the 2000s, and the birdcage got bigger. And it was an amazing time to be there. And then it started, the funnel kind of went back into a funnel and started becoming more narrow and closed up, so to speak. But, the history of that is, the persecution never stopped the church.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It never stunted its growth. In fact, it fed the growth, and it fed
Mm-hmm.
the passion, and it fed the commitment and the explosion of the church, especially in
Mm-hmm.
the 80s and the 90s.
Right.
Just the extreme growth that was taking place there. And now, as you're talking about with the younger generation, being born in that easier time of the 2000s, which I know some pastors who are from that, and yet they have learned, they have adapted, and they're trying to figure it out. And some of them have gone out as missionaries, as you
Mm-hmm.
talked about. We got to work with some in the Middle East a couple of years
Mm-hmm.
ago. We got to help some get into South Asia and
Mm-hmm.
just all kinds of things that are going on that it's not stopping. I'd almost say now, maybe, 20 years ago, this wasn't true. I don't know. I didn't see it as true, but definitely today, whatever we see today going on in the US, we can pretty much see it taking place in China within the church in
Mm-hmm.
terms of ministries and
Yeah,
the way
it's
they
just
care
harder.
for people. Yes, but it keeps moving.
Yeah, it's just harder. But they just, as I mean, one trip I made to China a few years ago, I was talking with a pastor, and he said, yeah, he said everything is harder, much more restrictive. But let me tell you what God is doing in my church. He didn't necessarily want to talk about how hard it was. Like, well, that's a given, but here's what we're doing. And that was pretty. I found that to be quite instructive. Again, we were focusing on the birdcage. Where are the boundaries? They're like, the boundaries are where the boundaries are. Here's what we're doing.
One thing a lot of them are not doing is whining.
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
I mean, they're, as you said, they're creative. They pivot. I think just because, as the article even indicates, they have to adjust so much in life as it is, just everyday
Right.
life.
Yeah, it's not unique. I mean, I think that was one of the points I was trying to make in the article is that, we just assume that persecution is the main challenge for the Christians in China. And for some that is true, for the pastors who are in prison or, people who can't meet anywhere. But at the end of the day, Chinese Christians are ordinary Chinese people. And life in China right now for the ordinary Chinese people, it has many, many challenges. The economy is bad. Educational system is brutally competitive. There's just a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of disillusionment coming out of COVID, kind of disillusionment with the government on how they handle COVID. So, and those are the challenges of the ordinary Chinese Christian. They're similar or the same as the challenge of their non-Christian neighbor.
So I'm just curious, have you ever thought what the Chinese church would look like 10 years from now?
No, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about that because who knows? Because what's China going to look like 10 years from now? And
Well,
I
everyone thought it
think
was
that,
leading toward democracy when it was, opening
yeah,
up.
I mean, right, yeah. Well, I mean, look at how we were fooled. We thought that it was on a straight line trajectory towards openness, freedom, and China would embrace the sunny uplands of democracy, which didn't happen. And perhaps we were not smart. Perhaps that wasn't a good idea to think that. Because a look at Chinese history would have maybe tempered that. I think, I think it will still be adapting to whatever the social and political environment is 10 years from now. It will be adapting and will have adapted to that. What that will be, I don't know. Do I think the party is going to be gone in 10 years? No. I think I think their grip on power is strong. But we thought that for Eastern Europe too. Um, so I guess what I'd say, I would say that it will still be adapting, it will still be innovating, it will still be, I think, believing, as I ended the article quoting my colleague, that hope is not in the recovery of space, the relaxation of restrictions. It's hope in Christ. And so I think the Chinese church will still be anchored in Christ, no matter what the political and social situation is.
I tell everyone everywhere we have a lot to learn from them. I mean, as much as in the past, definitely in the past, as Americans would come in and teach them how to be Christians and all that, to be honest, they need to be coming to us and teaching us how they operate, how they minister, how they move, how they live within the birdcage, how they adapt, and all those things. We really need them coming to our churches.
Yeah.
And not just here. I would argue that anywhere I go.
Right. And may I make a little shameless promotion?
Of course.
Because I think that I would encourage your listeners and your viewers to go to ChinaSource, because that's what we're trying to do at ChinaSource, is hear from Chinese Christians themselves. And I think that we now are moving towards, we have more than 60% of the articles that we publish on ChinaSource are written by Chinese, some in the mainland, some outside of the mainland. And so we're hearing directly from them on how they're facing these issues, what the challenges are, what the successes are. And I would commend, right now, our new ChinaSource journal was just published yesterday, and it's on the topic of public theology, on how do you live out your Christian faith in the public square, in not just in China, but in Southeast Asia. And I think if you read ChinaSource, you're going to put yourself in a place of learning from Chinese Christians.
And like I said earlier, I'm going to put the link to ChinaSource in the description. So go there. They do have some great resources. They have other resources that Joann did not mention, like ZG Briefs, which is like a consolidation of headlines for the week, and other things as well. But Joann, thanks. Thanks for hopping on again with me and for having this conversation.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Before I leave you, if you're enjoying the content that you're receiving here at the Living Enviado podcast and you haven't already done so, I would just encourage you to hit subscribe on whatever platform you're on. Leave a favorable review if you're loving the content on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, again, whatever platform you're on. And of course, if you're on YouTube listening or watching, then comment, engage, share it with 5 people that you know that would be encouraged or who is interested in China, or who needs a little bit of uplifting, like I said, encouragement by what you heard about the church in China, because it's a lot of good stuff that's going on there. And God is really working and moving in a place where, as Joann described it, the bird cage is shrinking, but it's not gone. It's just shrinking. But anyways, if you could do that for me, it would be very helpful. It'd help us get out in front of more people. And like always, just like the church in China, get out there, live bold, live courageous, and live Enviado.